Kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's roundtable discussion on nature and nurture, design and drama in our world today. This is part of the roundtable. This is part of the roundtable series that Flash Frontier is doing this year. But today we're coming with a very special edition as part of our Festival of Flash for National Flash Fiction Day in New Zealand. So this festival we've been doing for several years, and we love to get different writers because it's a literary festival, but also other disciplines because we really love looking at celebrating storytelling in all its forms. And so today we have a selection of writers, but also designers and anthropologists and researchers and performers, lots of different areas to discuss. So my name is Lola Elvey, and I've been working with National Flash for many, many years and running the youth competition for National Flash Fiction Day from Fingers Come a Toes and now from Flash Frontier. And there was a panel previously this morning, and there will be also a series of panels tomorrow as well. So there's lots to absorb and tune into. So to start, I thought that we could just go around the room and have everybody give yourselves a quick introduction and tell us a little bit about where you're from, what your area of work is, and what you're doing at the moment. David, should we start with you?
Okay, sorry, I was waiting for a name. Yeah, hi, I'm David Trowbridge. I'm a designer. I do things like this, lighting that's derived from nature. So nature's a key part of my work. And I'm also a bit of a writer. That's how I got to know Michelle. She edited my book, The Other Way, which is a travel book about some of the places I've been to around the world and experiences I've had there and the photographs I've been taking in those places. So that's my connection to the literary world.
Nice. Christian, you're next on my screen.
Right. Hi, I'm Christian Jensen. So I work across poetry, performance, and documentary. I'm a director of a word called Wayfinder, which is a group of performance poets and intermediate artists. And I'm also the impact lead for the Doc Edge Festival, which is the international documentary festival where I curate a immersive exhibition. Yep.
Nice. Yuki.
Hello, Toto. I'm a poet and anthropologist. I'm working across Chinese and English world, and I'm currently based in two places in Altiputi and also in China sometimes for doing my field work in about community garden design and all the permaculture design, which happens in the global north and global south. And very interesting to see like the environmental changes in these two places, and also draw lots of poetic inspiration for my non-academic writing about poetry and something. And so excited to have this roundtable with you guys.
Nice, thank you. Joe.
Good tato whānau. I'm Joe Jowett. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I work across sculpture, photography, video, drawing. I actually work as a camera operator and a video editor in the documentary space. And my art practice at the moment is concerned with what comedy does and what the political implications of comedy are. I'm a sometime writer as well. I've just completed my Master of Philosophy, so I haven't had a lot of time for non-academic writing. So I'm excited to be here and be on the panel with you guys today.
Nice. And last but not least, Josiah.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Josiah. I work across experimental arts in all disciplines, including queer, avant-garde, cut-up and assembled poetry, but also performance art, largely dealing with difficulty and what that means in art. However, at the moment, I'm performing in the production of Let the Right One In at the Court Theatre for another week.
Nice. And just a side note, Josiah happens to be our youth judge for this year's National Flash Fiction Day youth competition. So that's also great to have these kind of communities overlapping like this. So I'm Lola. Like I said, a little bit about me is I write poetry and music. My background's in music and physics, mathematics, um, and a lot of my research is looking at bioacoustics, sounds in the natural environment, and what those sounds can tell us about the health of the environment. So I'm interested in the kind of art as science communication sphere. Which I think overlaps with actually what a lot of us in the room are also interested in at these kinds of hybrid or interdisciplinary focuses. So I wanted to ask, just to get you started, or to get us started, I wanted to ask about starting with the name of this panel, Nature and Nurture and Design and Drama. Because these concepts are things that we probably all draw on, whether we think about it deliberately or not. Like it's a conscious and unconscious thing at the same time, or it fluctuates. So I was wondering, how do these aspects develop in your own work, or what role does like David, you were saying with your designs that are inspired by nature or using natural resources. Sometimes there's a direct link, or with community gardens. Sometimes it's a more atmospheric link, and then the design and drama element. How do those elements fit together for you in your work? And anyone who feels like answering, just jump in.
Were you asking me specifically about that?
Yes, but everyone too.
I mean, taking up that theme of nature and nurture, I think that nature is nurture. I mean, we know that mothers or children deprived of their mothers don't develop empathy. And empathy is only learnt through a mother, and it's also learnt through action to nature. And if we don't get that teaching in empathy, then we grow up being self-centered, goal-obsessed, and all the sort of nasty things which are appearing in our culture today, which I think is, to a certain extent, can be ascribed to our lack of connection to nature. There was a Australian writer writing in the Guardian just recently, talking about how she found that when she went walking in the trees, her writing became much easier. It started to flow. She was more creative. And I'm one of the world's greatest proponents of trees. I've been part of my world forever. But it's not trees, it's nature. I get the same feeling on the beach or on a mountaintop. If I'm having a creative block, I'll go for a walk and it starts to flow. I can kinds of my walking, but I can't sitting in front of a desk. So nature is both important to us because of that need to nurture. And I think that's a key problem with our culture, our societies today. But it's also, from the creative point of view, it's an incredible source of freeing up your creativity.
Very interesting. Yeah. Yes, I
Yeah.
totally agree. Yes, Yuki.
Yeah, I also think it's very interesting to think about like what is these two sound like concept and how they relate to each other. And often I will think about the word nature. I will think about what exactly we are talking about when we refer to the word nature. Sometimes I feel like we are talking about very, very different things. That's also like very interesting to see like what's our notion of nature. Like for me, I would because I was living different places between the global north and global south, and especially when I was living in the global south, I found that, like it's a bit difficult for me, especially in my field work, to perceive what is nature, because sometimes we can just see like lots of contaminated and damaged area, and do we will call it nature or not, like but it's obviously will not be a nurture thing for sometimes, but
Oh, yeah.
I sometimes feel like I draw lots of inspiration for when the infrastructure being shut down, and when the nature is sort of like breakdown or unfunctioning. I could see how the texture of the nature works, and I feel like the hearts of nature at that time also become more broadly and more widely open to some extent. And that's also the time I got to notice like industrial damage and all the like colonial history that happens in our land. I think that's also a part of aspect I was drawing inspiration from the nature, and nowadays, yeah.
Yeah, I think I want to jump in and just comment on there's this, like you said, what is nature to us? And I was thinking more of the nature of our being as a person. But I think it relates in a lot of ways. Like a lot of the work I do is kind of focused on disrupting in the sense of, quite often we're overloaded with information, but I kind of see our nature as a direction of our will. So, and what I mean by that is, when we disrupt this information overload, we can connect back to what this direction of our nature is, not just towards closing in or stagnating, but also towards some sort of activity or complexity. So when I look at nature or someone like David's designs, it inspires that, that moment of sublime or that moment of aspiring towards uh, something more. So in that way, I think nature and nurture is very intrinsically connected. It's not two separate things.
Particularly in the sense that if we're talking about creative practice and the idea of things that happen in space, of which writing is also an activity, it's something that happens in a body in space. Our actions in our day-to-day lives take place inside and inscribe themselves upon nature, which is sort of what Yuki was talking about before, that our histories are already inscribed upon environmental kind of landscapes. But in the context of an individual practice, building on what Christian was saying, I think there are ways that we all read as texts to the public world at all times, which has to do with our social upbringings and the contexts in which we find ourselves rooted inside. But this becomes really obvious in a stage context, even more so than a poetic context, where like if you just put a person on a stage, depending on the audience that they're in front of, their perceived nature will change. And there's all sorts of things that can influence this, the proximity to the audience, the clothing that the person is wearing. So the idea of nature, in my view, can quite easily be contaminated, and as a neutral term, not a pejorative term, can easily be, transformed by things that we do in our practice on top of that, which are nurturing contexts. So that's my view on the relation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting take, because it's kind of, rather than them being this kind of binary, that there's actually a kind of porous relationship between the two that's continually in flux. And I think from picking up on what you're saying, Josiah, I love the idea that you're approaching difficulty in your creative practice, because I think that for me, the nature versus nurture thing, I was thinking more broadly about within creative practice, we kind of approach making with, there's a separation between what we might want to do and what we're trying to do, and then what the work wants to do, and there's always a kind of, for me, a dynamic tension between those things, and it's about having a good balance of the two. So you're not, I come from a background as a video editor, so in that space, you're really trying to make yourself disappear in the work. So it's a sculptural practice in a lot of ways, from my perspective, but you're actually trying to find the voice in the work and letting it speak, the same way that, maybe the old school stoneworkers are always trying to look for the structure within the stone. In editing, it's the same thing. And so I think this idea of nature versus nurture in creative practice for me is about how you foster those two things and how you manage them together, right? So how you're not completely trying to have a total control over the work, but allowing the work to have that dance with you, I suppose.
Yeah, so one of my questions was about nature versus nurture, like looking at these, because this is an expression that we use like so often that it's really it's really something that's easy to grab for, nature versus nurture. These two are these opposing forces. But of course, the panel is nature and nurture. How do these two actually feed into each other as things that are not so necessarily in conflict? And I think some of you have already touched on that too. And the idea of when we really start digging deep into what separates nature and nurture, or the inside and the outside, these different atmospheres, it becomes really the boundaries become very blurred in terms of, and what you were talking about, Josiah, with perception too, and Yuki talking about different areas of nature that have maybe become degraded or threatened. So I was, oh yeah, just sorry, Joe, did you want to say something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was just wondering more about that, like how do you, because sometimes those conflicts can actually be really productive when you have this kind of conflict between what the project wants to be and what you want it to be. It can actually transform it into a third thing. How do you see that happening in your work?
In my view, that's where art happens, and that's what creative practice actually is. And the practice of becoming an artist, I think, is the practice of doing that synthesis. I don't know, we use the word creative practice a lot, I guess, as practicing professionals. There's a oxymoronic thing. But sometimes when I'm teaching young people, I use the word practice, and it isn't very familiar to them. They're kind of like, what do you mean? Like, it's not practice. But it's just a useful verb in the sense that it is something you have to do in order to carry on. And just to get, I can give you like a really clear example of how this functions in this context, just before I hand over to someone else that would like to jump in. But like, if I just reorient myself and sit out here, I'll seem like a different kind of man the next 10 minutes.
Totally different.
Yeah. I want to jump in a little bit there, both on Joseph and Josiah, because my work with documentary, some of the best documentary work that I see are ones where the polished story takes a different turn, and you can tell that there's an organic part of the story where it's sort of taken its own journey, and the filmmaker and the subjects take part in this new sort of, they're exploring new work. And it takes away that overly polished sense of trying to control a story, and you become engaged with it. And sometimes it's by design, and sometimes it's just with allowing yourself to go where the story takes you. So there's a beauty in that imperfection when you allow that to show itself, I think. And like you said, like a lot of the installation work that I like doing is actually trying to break that barrier between observer and an audience, and allow for interactivity, allow for organic things to happen, or even say to people, this is actually intended for you to touch. And sometimes it takes a little bit of a push to get some people to step away from that role as a passive observer and actually engage with stuff in a different way. But when they do, you see that it starts impacting people in a different way.
It's a very colonial thing to kind of impose a will externally to make, I want this to happen, this is my idea, rather than being embedded in something and enabling it and allowing it to grow and have a life of its own. And that's the lesson that nature teaches us, because nature is this wonderful community where everything is linked and connected. And that's why I said we are nature. A lot of indigenous, particularly hunter-gatherer people, don't have a word for nature because there is no other. They are, well, it's everything. It's life. And I think as soon as we sort of start to objectify it, we're putting ourselves as being something separate and special, rather than being enabling stuff from within.
Yeah, I want to follow up with David, and yeah, lots of my work was trying to search for like the indigeneity in the different worlds. And I think yeah, I've been also experienced a lot of like whether we say it's a binary of nature and nurture, or with nature and culture binaries. Especially I was like when I was sitting on a desk and writing my academic stuff, I felt like I touched lots of concept about nature, but exactly I was in a very separate and binary world of working on with it. So recently I was trying to taking one of my trying, for example, I was trying to make it more like more sensory and more embodied. And so I was trying to use the media of my skin um, to see like how is the skin. So I use the word for like skinship and starship, which was inspired by one of the anthropologists, Sophie Chow. And we see lots of our skin as the like the skin of soil and the skin of human. It's connected and being also it's on our skin, and we are just on a different skin, on the different texture of on this word making. So I always feel when the soil skin, they have something, they are drying, they are being contaminated or something that must be have some relation on my skin as well. And my skin how's the relationship with my skin and the other parts of the skin, the tree skin and the skin of one flowers. I'm trying to see some kinship with them and feel some more embodied feeling with them. Yeah, so that's one of my trying recently to kind of see myself out beyond the binary of nature and culture. Yeah.
I think you make an interesting point because we are kind of a host for a significant, the microbiota that live within us, for example, if you're talking about inside and outside. And, we contain multitudes actually when it comes to the microbial kind of landscape that's kind of inside us. And you make me think about Donna Haraway's writing about kinning and this idea of she sees nature in quite a different context, and perhaps the current troubles of the world in a different kind of context, and that we should be kind of making friends with all of the kind of ramifications of what we've done, and not trying to separate out nature from ourselves. To your point, David, but kind of being able to kind of be with that, and I think doing that synthesis, like you say, Josiah, like actually meeting all of what we come up against in creative practice is where the juicy stuff is. And I think this idea that we have to separate from that, and also practically, if we live in the world, we have to kind of contend with all of the manifestations of what we've done, which is significant to the world, but also from a practice perspective, on a day-to-day, we're kind of rubbing up against the fact that we need to eat and we need a place to sleep, and we might need to pay rent, or all of those sorts of things. And so finding how creative practice sits within that, and the friction that's there, kind of speaks to that, the synthesis that you pointed out, Josiah. And I think it's a really nice place, actually. And I was thinking about David Hockney today because he passed away, and I loved his approach to drawing that went through all of these different kinds of interface, just because of his love of pictures, right? And he ended up drawing on an iPad, which a lot of people were like, "That's just, it's a terrible, terrible way to approach painting." But for him, because he was a little older and it was very hard for him to wash up all of his paintbrushes and to go through that process, he could get up and make a painting very, very easily. And it was a kind of it was a way to meet creative practice where you are, which I think kind of has a lot of weight now, because we kind of just have to meet it where we are, I think.
Yeah, and that kind of ties in with what Josiah was talking about, working in the space of difficulty too. And
Yeah.
it's interesting how, you know, everybody's version of difficulty is different, actually, and how we try to. And there's something about creative practice and the idea of practice too. And practice being something that is not perfection. Practice isn't something you achieve, it's something you work through. And there is an element of creative practice that does live in that difficult space. Like it's to some extent, maybe it's not always supposed to be easy, but what those difficulties are or how we choose to challenge ourselves is something we have agency over, and it's something that evolves as we need it to. What about when you're working with, because I'm thinking of David's design, and also Yuki, your work with community gardens, because these are elements where you're working very closely with nature, but you're also manipulating nature to suit a kind of human intention, right? So how do you find yourselves kind of balancing or negotiating that space, that it's not at the end of the day, when you have a lamp that you've crafted, it's not something that's grown out of the ground. It's a lamp that has electricity and it goes in a house, and most people might put it on their bedside table where it never has anything to do with the world outside their four walls. And with a community garden, it's a slightly different thing, but it still is very much it's a need that arises because of humanity and the way we've evolved, right? So how do you find that space?
It's sort of an inevitable result of not looking inward but looking outward. I mean, I've always spent a lot of time walking in mountains and wild places, and without that input, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. And what I'm trying to do with the work is to kind of bring an element of that into the otherwise largely sterile homes that we have with the cold white walls to create that sense of patterning, which humans need. I mean, we've worked with a scientist in Oregon, at University of Oregon in Portland, who works with fractals, and he sat uh, test samples people in front of a blank white wall and attached electrodes to the brains and measured the alpha or beta waves that were generated by the environment they're looking at. And the flat white wall generates alpha waves, which are stress inducing and readying us to fight or flight. And as soon as you projected an image of a tree or patterns, fractal patterns onto that wall, the brain changed and produced beta waves, which are relaxing and making us feel okay. So we're not okay in an environment like that of white walls and square rectangles. We're okay in an environment like that of trees, patterns, because we spent, I don't know how many million years as humans evolving in the forests of Africa. So those patterns are embedded, they're ingrained in us. And what I see, what I'm trying to do is regenerate some of that connection back into within our home and living spaces.
You brought an interesting association for me, because I have a really affection for working in untraditional spaces with installation, or I mean, the most recent case, the abandoned exoskeleton of the Smith and Co. building, and in these previously sterile environments, but then semi-abandoned, you have this kind of like bringing back to nature almost by its sort of falling apart, but allowing an artistry to come in there and repaint it, reinvent it, is a really exciting space to be in, because you're bringing this past sort of relic into a completely different organic life, and inviting artists to bring in new perspectives. For me, it's kind of like a reimagining of ritual, but looking at ritual not as just traditional formats, but using the tools that you had at hand to embody nature around you, and sort of talking between that nature and nurture, to find, like you said, like your brain fights that sterile environment, and you want to bring in that reflection out so that we can direct ourselves away from that almost, I would say, trauma of these sterile spaces, and the drone that we're kind of like asked to be in, even in work scenarios where you're doing repetitive tasks, you're you're in this sterile, work hard environments, and I think there's part of our will or desire that wants to break free of that. And sometimes, we're not even conscious of it, but bringing in nature can sometimes break free of that. I guess is where I'm heading.
Yeah, and I think, Christian, the built environment is this, people talk about it as being a kind of a tyranny, that we're continually encapsulated in the built environment. There's a really lovely conceit that this idea that DIY is the ultimate form of kind of resistance, because you're changing this built environment, which, like it or not, we live in these envelopes, and we're continually swimming in these kind of pools of that indicate ways for us to behave, and so being able to kind of respond to them kind of creatively or practically, the way you are, David, by bringing in, more organic shapes into it, is a kind of form of resistance against the kind of tyranny of the built environment, which is a fun thing to play around with, I think, and a useful thing. I like the idea of DIY with regard to creative practice, because I've been thinking a lot about, with a friend, about the idea of the workaround, and the idea of, in the context of meeting the world where we are, that we just, do what you can, start where you are, use what you have, this idea. And that's a way to respond to the built environment, and to change it and with what you have, and therefore kind of alter it to your own nature, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I also was very drawn to the kind of like what Joseph talked about, like DIY stuff. I think like for me, design, especially like using things in the nature to DIY, also means like we don't have to live on to all the things we get given by the current systems, and we can create a system otherwise, and make the current system kind of obsolete by creating. Yeah, and thank you for Lola's question about community garden. That's really also the things I think it's related to what we talked about, the DIY future things. And I also can see like there are commons of nature, like just as Debbie said, like for like the people in the hunter and gathering society, they do not have a thing what is called private, what is a common, and what is the skin of nature, what is not, and the skin of everything is being transferred and it's being like in the gifting economy sort of style, probably just more in that way. So I was thinking the commons of nature is like we still have this thing, have a ground we can be built together, rather than just we see like everything is in our enclosure, and it's yeah, I think just the commons and the nature, I just draw this concept together to see what is my sort of notion of nature like. And I think one thing it's also attracted me when I was first as a like doing my field work in the community garden, also as a volunteer. I imagine like I don't have to talk a lot, and I connect people with like heart and hands. With is for example, we are just digging and or weeding together, but we don't have to talk. We use language to build connection. I think that's a very poetic side of like human relationship and relationship with the nature, and also as someone who like my first language is not English. I feel like it's I can create lots of like freedom and a vacant space for me to imagine a relationship otherwise. So so that's the things I really get interested. Yeah.
All this about reimagining relationships, reimagining spaces, it takes a kind of vision working within a system or outside a system or building new systems. And it makes me think, I think a few of us have experience working with different kinds of communities also, different kinds of marginalized communities or communities where maybe sometimes something that is outside the box is actually a necessary option. And I think it's interesting hearing you all talk too. That it makes me think of how we've arrived in this place where our world is very structured, and we have a kind of homogeneity to our lives. But I think a lot of people actually feel like it's not the right fit. So we've got this kind of one size fits all, but I'm not sure it's even one size fits most. I think a lot of people kind of have this craving for something a little bit different, but the idea that alternatives have to be kind of a second, third, or last resort. It's not the first option that's readily available. So how might we use our creative practice to try to I guess make these visions of alternate possibilities more accessible or tangible to people? Do you think there's a role for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is in DIY and really encouraging people to actually just do it themselves. A huge part, it's sort of cliche, to some extent, but like a huge part of the moment that we find ourselves in is through stratification and compartmentalization and definition. For example, as we talked about earlier, ourselves as outside of nature as opposed to within nature, but also the commons as something that can be defined on particular terms, and whose terms are they? But that has also happened in the domain of creative practice, that we have this idea of like a specialized creative practitioner, but creative practice is part of everyone's lives, whether they know it or not. And reframing that and actually being quite serious about the idea that we're all doing it all the time. How often do you cook dinner? That's a creative practice. How often are you like reading a book to your kids in like a funny little voice? That's a creative practice. But to actually embed that and take that seriously as something that is creative and is embedded in relational stuff with other people around us, rather than this specialized thing that like only people who are getting published or doing public installations have access to. Like it's connected to that idea of the commons. The creative practice is a commons as well that we all have access to, but we're in a constructed intellectual environment that tries to split that out of a layman realm. But it's all of us. We have that.
Yeah, and creativity is kind of fundamental to humanity. Like whatever, lots of different theories floating around about what defines humanity, but creativity is often a real central aspect. It's hard to imagine that we've come to a place where creativity can be so siloed.
Yeah, and I think both siloed and kind of I think stratified is also a good word, but also kind of it feels like in the age that we're living in, there's this incredible amount of loneliness in amongst this kind of perceived connection through various digital methods and so-called social media. And I think there's this idea that everything that's creative has to be kind of almost commodified in some way, shape, or form. And so I think bringing kind of reframing that into being the Creative Commons is a really nice it's a really nice way to look at it, and a really nice way to kind of bring it back into something people can touch, because it's kind of there for you every day, right? And it's just a possibility of kind of opening up those structures and methods and possibilities for people to kind of touch it.
I've just come back from Australia, and I was up in the Northern Territories looking at some of the rock art up there, and got involved in reading some of the history of the Aboriginal people. And as we know, they've been there for 65,000 years, a continuous culture. But they've got stories which they've passed on verbatim through how many generations of that time, right from the beginning. I mean, we have this in our culture, things get twisted around by Chinese whispers, and a phrase can get changed very quickly as it passes on from one to another. But they have a very strict way of keeping that history, that culture alive. And art is a key part of that. all their songs and dances are performances. And in the performances, they're remembering and telling the stories and passing them on to the next generation. And they do it with not just performances, but with drawing on the sand and on their bodies. So for them, right from the beginning, from way, way back, art was a fundamental part of being human, of being of the culture, keeping the culture alive and passed on.
This like is quite close to heart at the moment because I've sort of been rediscovering my own old roots within the Sami people. I'm originally from Norway, but there's a lot of this suppressed Sami heritage that's coming through. I'm seeing a lot in documentary work, and I'm seeing these voices coming back to the surface. And it's a similar thing to the Aboriginal. It's a very ritual and heritage way of keeping that story going through generations, but also using stones and rocks and symbology on that to sort of keep that. So it's not just old drawings with random symbols. These symbols used to mean something. They had systems and patterns that a lot of it's been lost in history, but a lot of it still remains through these ancient stories. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and I think lots of we talk about like reminds me also like how the word creativity is being institutionalized and how we sometimes say creativity is like kind of go out of the box, institutional box or kind of commodity box to doing something. Yeah, and I think like for me like especially like using my whether it's in English or in my mother tongue write in poetry about nature or I'm more bored in the notion of nature around me is kind of like um um kind of like continue my everyday life or in the very and continue my culture in a very everyday life way and because we speak and we write and mother tongue is just the like the tongue of our mother speaks and it's just the maybe it's maybe we have some like trauma or like also some sweet moments of our mother tongues or our previous languages, our original languages, but there's just that things that makes our mother tongue it's so powerful and so alive. As when we speak, we were transformed. When we write, we transform it. It's just like a sharp knife and a honey. We just hanging our tongues, our languages. So I also find like it's very fascinating for how it could be an everyday practice of culture, our culture, and creativity.
Yeah, and along the line of that kind of along the lines of that discussion of heritage too, and coming back to something Joseph was saying about loneliness today, and also Josiah, you said something about when parents read to their kids. I notice a lot in my own teaching that a lot of kids actually don't their parents don't necessarily read to them these days. The parents might not have time, or for whatever reason, they just don't. And um, creativity is becoming something that is a luxury, and a lot of kids in the education world don't necessarily have that kind of free reign or even that kind of hereditary connection through language like what you're talking about, Yuki. And I wonder if that is actually contributing a lot to this kind of pandemic of loneliness or isolation, because creativity offers us an immense opportunity not only to connect with each other but also to ourselves. And if we don't have that, if we are only focused on the kind of, for lack of a better term, material world, we're focused on what we can produce, what we can accomplish, we're focused on achievement as opposed to practice, then of course creativity falls by the wayside, right?
I think that's an interesting provocation, and I broadly agree with you, but I do just want to throw a little spanner in the works of the provocation by sort of suggesting that the condition in which young people, I include myself in there, I'm 25, kind of like find ourselves in terms of like doom scrolling and phone addiction is a condition of non-productivity, or maybe of abstracted productivity where we're becoming like the advertorial kind of consumer, and that there is a creative practice embedded in the way that we interact with these devices, but that it's potentially a less fulfilling one than than through another lens. Yeah, I just like I'm not entirely comfortable saying that that's not a creative practice, because I think the way that a lot of those young people are feeling about what they're engaging is actually a similar process as doodling on a page, but the technology is different. But I am quite doomy about it. I just but that's my
But is
first.
there something paradoxical about that too? The idea, I mean, even the idea, and also when I said that, you know, when I was talking about productivity, I meant more not so much doom scrolling or something like that, although maybe, but no, I meant more like the way we structure our free time for, and the way
Yeah.
kids structure their free time with
Yeah.
activities, with sports, with extra lessons, things like this. But is there something paradoxical about the idea that if we're like the whole thing that hooks people in with social media is the kind of effect it has on the brain that makes you feel like you're achieving something, but you're actually not achieving a lot compared to other activities. So there is this kind of illusion of satisfaction or obtaining something, but it's something that's actually really elusive.
And I think there's an illusion of agency and control in some way as well.
Yes.
I finished this exhibition recently, and I ended up, for I'm not sure why, just due to reasons of the way the project took me, I ended up making a lot of remote controls some out of bronze, some out of ceramic, because I was thinking a lot about the work was called Power and Control, but it was sort of about the mobile phone, really, because in some ways, to your point, Josiah, we are kind of, there's a curatorial aspect to what we're doing, right? We're curating our experience by going, oh, I like that, I don't like that, I'm going to look at that, I'm going to watch that, I'm not going to watch that. But, and to me, it's the whakapapa goes back to the remote control, because the way that we used to channel flip is kind of like the very distant ancestor of, you know, whether it's TikTok or Reels or whatever. But we are in a different space now, I think, because, you know, through these devices, we're dealing with a massively complicated, significant, hugely profitable company that has these incredible PhDs and algorithms that are kind of very much driving us to engage. And you know, I know for myself, I have to take the apps off my phone because I don't trust myself not to end up getting lost in the doom scroll. You know, but that said, to your point, there is a lot of creativity that happens in these spaces. You know, I trained to be an editor 20 years ago now, and so you know, learned on an Avid. Actually, you know, did some tape to tape stuff, and seeing what editing has become in a vertical format in these formats, it's really creative and it's interesting and it's different, and it is a kind of storytelling. You know, this is kids inscribing their view of the world on the rock. Really, this is kind of where we're at, and there's so much beautiful creativity in there. But I certainly know how it makes me feel after I've spent 40 minutes looking at it. Isn't how I want to feel? You know?
But on that, and then I'll stop talking because I want to hear what everyone else has to say. But just on side note on the remote control too, that maybe one of the differences too is that now it's such an individualized thing. Like in the past, if you're flipping through channels on a remote, if you live with anybody else in the same house, they are all also sharing that experience, whether they want to or not. And now we have this totally isolationist way of dealing with entertainment and processing information. So we actually can we curate something, but we curate it specifically for ourselves, and we don't necessarily have to share it with anybody. And you can have two people sitting in the same room, sitting right next to each other, and they're living in two totally different worlds of entertainment or processing. I wonder if that is part of what.
I think this is a huge challenge with the way that we currently define creative practice in Western cultures, actually, is that particularly even in like our school systems and things, like I see this in contexts where I teach, there's this primary idea that the primary benefit is about self-expression. And that's certainly something that art does. And I'm not sure it should be what we frame as the primary outcome. I do think, like, as we've talked today, like community building and resistance to dominant modes of thought is way more productive. And as long as we view creative practice as something that drives our understanding of ourselves above our understanding of the world around us or others' understanding of us, it's going to continue along those lines. It's sort of interesting to think about, like when Joseph was talking about phones just then, I had this like slightly flippant but somewhat serious thought that, like, I grew up in the smartphone era, like, and the books that I enjoy reading the most are like Moby Dick and James Joyce, which actually have this like formal quality to them that is sort of like they're quite frenetic and fast changing. And I think, I don't know, maybe there's something to that.
I think what you're losing there in that kind of talking about creativity embedded in doom scrolling or whatever is that I mean, art is fundamentally subversive, and it's not in that situation. You're absolutely being led by the system. I mean, you say you can play, you can choose what you do, but you don't. It's all chosen for you. And I think that we need to think of creativity as being much more subversive, as disruptive.
Mm.
That's like what Joe was saying about the illusion of agency, right?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe in a way, and maybe even coming back to the kind of homogeneity of our general existence too, or the systems that we have in place, I think a lot of times we I think a lot of times the agency that we do have is actually hidden, or like I think we have agency in those unexpected moments. Like we have agency in the kind of very small things that we do, but a lot of the kind of life choices that are presented to us as choices maybe have less agency actually than they're presented. I think agency is a surprising element, or it's not where you expect to find it, maybe.
I think you're given that little bit of agency just to make you feel satisfied, but actually you don't really have any.
Well, that's why in a lot of my work, I almost feel a responsibility to disrupt some of that and create these ritual or create interactivity to invite people to, rather than just observing a performance or observing an exhibition, you're giving people a new place to have community, have interaction, have shared experiences and rituals, even if it's using the digital technology. It's about finding ways of having actual interpersonal experiences with them. So I think that's really important to break that solitary experience into something that we experience together.
Yeah, and your work with rituals too, because rituals, like ritual or tradition, has a kind of, there's a repetitive element to that. There's an element that is unifying, but it's a different kind of unity than just something that's homogenous and the same.
Mm.
And it's interesting to try to reclaim that too, because I think I mean, I don't know if what you all think of this, but I feel like actually one of the problems is, even though we have this kind of uniform existence now, perhaps we don't. I don't know if people really value tradition in the same ways. I think that tradition also is a shared thing, and we've become more isolationist or individualistic in the way we conduct our lives. And it's interesting to think about the idea of what shared experience really means, or what it really comes from, and how we can rekindle tradition or ritual in a way that's not like traditionalist, conservative, going back in time, but actually finding value in these symbols. That's what ritual is, right? It's value in symbols of connection.
I think it's like the novel, right? The novel used to just be novelle, like new writing, but now it's a certain format. Tradition, in my mind, used to be something living, organic, constantly developed, constantly owned by the next generation, as opposed to something as we perceive it now, a rigid old thing that is a structure from the past. So I think and this is where the idea of ritual and the idea of tradition to me is something that we should own, but take into the new technology, our new tools, whatever, play with it in the same way they used to play with it.
I think we've got a very different idea of tradition to the Maori, who for them tradition is very important. They have to maintain those traditions, and that's how they've carried their culture through over a long period of time. And I think we're in danger of disrespecting tradition and throwing too much of it away.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and I suspect a lot of people probably have or need more tradition in their lives, maybe even than we realize, in the sense that when you have your morning cup of coffee, that's a tradition, right? It's something that you do reliably and consistently, and it has meaning beyond the thing itself. And maybe it's that search for meaning also that is what unites us as people, but also pushes us to envision something different, beyond, or better than what we have in front of us, um, and where creativity lies really that search for making meaning out of the materials around you, which is a little of that DIY stuff again.
Yeah, and I guess that's the responsibility that we have as humans now and creative practitioners, but all people really, is to kind of meet what is, for most people, speaking as tau iwi Pākehā, living in a secular environment, a lot of the structures that perhaps were around prior, for the prior generation, might not have the same sort of weight, and that's different for all kinds of people. Different folk have got different ways of approaching it. But I think now we have a responsibility to kind of get together around things like matariki, and to kind of embrace where we are with regard to where we live and who we interface with, and kind of build those traditions or embrace the ones that are there. And I think that we still have, I think theatre is like a beautiful space of live storytelling that we still have, that still contains ways of us getting together. And we're building these new ways of interacting all the time. I think, like within my social structure, we have a bunch of, rituals like the annual crystal polish, where we all go for a swim on the shortest day every year together. It's something we've been doing for maybe 12 or 15 years now, and it's just something that's built and developed, and it's around marking a time or whatever. But I think we have responsibility as creative practitioners, and I think it's a nice space to kind of lean into.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think traditional is it's not like a fixed term, and it's not like a pure traditional things we can return to. It's still like very livable, very like can be transformed over the place and time, and we can we are thinking of, when we think of not return to some tradition, to see it as a stagnant things. We can we also see lots of resistance going on, the struggle is going on, how to bring that spaces to be speakable and be acknowledged, and to being collectively lots of discourse about traditions. We bring it together. I think it's also things that creativity can does.
Yeah, and there's lots of traditions that we probably don't want to go back to, right? So
Yes.
Yes, but that's like what Christian was saying about tradition being a living thing, right? It's something that, and maybe that's where we get stuck on, at least in English, the distinction between what is tradition and what is traditional. Like those are two actually very different concepts, which I think is maybe what you were saying too, Yuki.
Yeah, I always were interested, how do you see those two words, Ola?
Yeah, and that kind of ties back with our origin point of nature and nurture, and how we develop, and also how we develop these we kind of are very quick to jump to these dichotomies, or these kind of boundaries that help us define ourselves and the world around us, and the world as something other than ourselves, and all these distinctions that we've been talking to. So I feel like we've really circled around these topics quite smoothly today.
Mm.
And I'm sure we could keep going for forever, but I'm just aware of the time. And so, on the just to wrap up, I was just wondering. I think we've talked a lot about creative practice in general and a little bit about our own fields. But I was wondering, where do you see where do you see yourselves in the near future, in the long future, however you take the question? Where do you see yourselves and your creative practice evolving in its dialogue with the world that we have today, which is changing at an almost unprecedented rate? How do you see yourselves carrying your creative practice forward?
I'm increasingly becoming interested in magic.
Magic,
I really mean that quite seriously, but yeah.
like magic tricks?
No, like magic ending with a CK, like
Ah, yeah, okay.
that says like a practice of shifting
Yeah.
reality. Yeah.
That's actually so great. Because, and I know this is a little bit of a side tangent, but I do this work with sound, like looking at what the natural sounds tell us about the health of an environment or how those sounds interact. And often, like, I get this feeling when I explain some of this to other people, or when I come across a new study, it seems like magic. It feels like magic, and it is like there is this kind of rekindling of, like, we don't need to be so cynical all the time, and really, magic is just a word for stuff that we haven't explained yet. Like, and I feel like that interplay between magic and science is such a beautiful space to be in.
Yeah.
Because we think of science as this cut and dry, academic thing that's really, like, specific and specialized, but actually that idea that really it's about curiosity, it's about discovery, it's about embracing what we don't know, and I guess that's also where creativity is.
Yeah, I have to agree to say I'm obsessed with magic ritual and the idea of owning that word again, and not being scared to, science and religion have had their time. Maybe there's some room for magic again, but not the parlor trick magic, the old
Yeah.
the old original meaning of the unknown and the unknowable.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's marvelous. I think there's space for the ineffable, and that's what the kind of art that I think is always extraordinary to encounter is art that's able to speak to something that is in that ineffable space, that is beyond language, and is touching something that sits in that kind of sublime space. For myself, I'm going to continue to probably use humor to try and speak to what's happening in the current political kind of burning dustbin that's kind of going on out there, because for me, that's been a really useful tool and a methodology to try and both make sense of something that doesn't make sense, but also to kind of build these momentary communities of understanding. For me, humor creates these kind of ruptures that has got a kind of magic to it. Really, the way that it can make connections across spaces that shouldn't connect with this power of lightness, I think for me is really useful in the space of creative practice and contemporary art. So that's where I'm going to kind of try and continue forward to deal with what's happening out there.
I guess I've been doing what I've been doing for over 50 years, and that word tradition comes in quite strongly, because it's the tradition of making, of using your hands, of working with natural materials, of DIY, which is an essential part of that. And what time I've got left, it'll be continuing doing that. I'm not going to make any massive changes now. I think that tradition is really important, that we maintain that, and I'll do my best to keep it going.
Yeah, I also love the word magic. I think it's generally very transformative if you like really believe that, and it's actually create another sense of um cosmology and or ontology of our world. Like what is your belief and what is your work and that's the thing. Like if you are really believe there's a different world, another world. It's really just in our breathing everyday life, and it's our like everyday works. It's just a literary magic things I've been trusting and also continuing.
Yeah, so interesting. And this idea also of the kind of odd pair of magic and tradition, or newness and history. They actually have to go, like, innovation and history go hand in hand, and observation and creativity go hand in hand. So I think that's a wonderful space to end the conversation, although it's sad to say goodbye to you all. Um, but thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for being part of this discussion. It's wonderful to have conversations like this. And once again, this is part of the Roundtable series, and this month's edition of Roundtable is in celebration of National Flash Fiction Day, which of course is also aligning with Matariki. So it's nice actually that somebody mentioned that as well. So it's a very celebratory month in the darkest, shortest time of year. So thank you all for coming and for being here.
Takitiano.
Thanks for having us. Nice to meet you all.
You all.
Thanks for everyone's contribution. Yeah.